Thank you all for being here. We're so excited to have you. My name is Eliza Jones, and on behalf of the Department of History, I would like to thank you all for attending our 5th annual Black History Month lecture. A lecture whose existence we actually owe the greatest thanks to Shannon Eaves. This month's lecture is Sexual Violence in American Slavery in Charleston, a local examination of the South's rape culture featuring our very own Dr. Shannon Eaves. And along with my fellow members of the Lecture Planning Committee, Zeb Dingley and Sam Payne, and our Department Chair, Phyllis Justice, we would like to thank our generous co-sponsors: African American Studies, the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, the Carolina Low Country and Atlantic World Program, the Center for Public Choice and Market Process, the Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston, the Civility Institute, the Department of Political Science, the Office of Institutional Diversity, and Women's and Gender Studies. We would also like to thank the School of Humanities and Social Sciences for financial support, and our interim dean, Jason Coy, for being here and closing the program today. We would also especially like to recognize members of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Iota Omicron chapter, of which Dr. Eaves is a member of the Graduate Council. And finally, we would like to thank President Hsu for making the opening remarks, and Dr. Tamara Butler, Executive Director of the Avery Research Center, for introducing Dr. Eaves following his remarks. At the end of the lecture, there will be time for a Q&A, and you will all have an opportunity to ask questions, followed by a reception in the atrium just outside this room at 6:30. And we want to thank you all again for being here, and I'm going to hand it over now to President Hsu. Thank you so much.
Melissa, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's such an honor for me to welcome you to this great event. I must say that this is by far the largest crowd that I've seen for the celebration of Black History Month. And I want to welcome you to this celebration of Black History Month, but more specifically and more importantly, to the celebration of the important research and scholarship of Professor Shannon Eaves. Her work not only enriches our academic community, but also challenges us to think deeper, reach further, and engage more fully in the pursuit of knowledge. Dr. Eaves has dedicated her academic career to better understanding the tragic impacts of slavery, especially on women. That scholarship is a testament to the power of rigorous inquiry. Dr. Eaves' work is illuminating, bringing to light a part of America's darkest and most painful history. By understanding this aspect of slavery and its profound impact on a people and place, our region and our country may hope to heal more fully. Now, let me turn the lectern over to Dr. Tamara Butler, Executive Director of the Avery Research Center, to introduce Dr. Eaves.
Good evening or afternoon or whatever time of day it is. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
All right. So Dr. Shannon Eaves earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and currently serves as Associate Professor of African American History at the College of Charleston. If you don't know what that means she got tenure. So I want to give a round of applause for that. Dr. Eaves has been awarded doctoral research fellowships from the American Association of University Women and Rutgers University. At the College of Charleston, she serves as on the executive board for the Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston and the Committee on Commemoration and Landscapes. She also serves on the executive boards of the Association of Black Women Historians and the Southern Labor Studies Association. Specializing in 19th century U.S. history, African American history, slavery, and gender in the antebellum South, Dr. Eaves' book, Sexual Violence and American Slavery, The Making of a Rape Culture in the Antebellum South, extends that work. Published by UNC Press in 2024, her book examines how the rape and sexual exploitation of enslaved women created a rape culture that was woven into the very fabric of the antebellum society, influencing daily life for both slave and enslavers. I hope everybody is taking notes, not just for extra credit, but also for your own fortification and well-being, right? Because we'll be able to test after it. So, and I'm dead serious, because I'm not gonna let you touch the reception table unless you answer a question. So, with that said, I want to welcome Dr. Shannon Eaves to the podium.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I also want to take the opportunity to thank all of you all for being here. It really warms my heart just to look out and see so many faces on a Wednesday afternoon where it is very rainy and cold and you could be anywhere else, but you're here. And I don't take that for granted, and I appreciate it. I would like to thank my department and their unwavering support when I came to them with this idea to launch this Black History Month lecture series 5 years ago. And I never envisioned that I would one day be making that lecture, but I appreciate so much the support and the invitation this year. Thank you to the members of the committee for all of the hard work that you did in planning not only tonight's lecture, but also our student seminar that happened earlier today, which was, again, such a powerful, scholarly and, engaging opportunity. And it's one of the things that really helps to fortify me and remind me of why I do this work. So today, my lecture this evening will serve as an introduction to my recently published book, Sexual Violence and American Slavery, The Making of a Rape Culture in the Antebellum South, which is the first study of how the South cultivated a rape culture that had political, social, and economic consequences for both enslavers and the enslaved. I will also tell you a story of an enslaved woman in a prominent Charleston position to illustrate how enslaved people maneuvered the South's rape culture in the very city we navigate today. I'll start by telling you a story about the famed U.S. abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but it bears repeating because its revelations of enslaved life, big and small, inspired me to write this book. And this is actually a cover of the book. As a young boy, Frederick Douglass felt great admiration for his Aunt Hester. He described her as a young woman of noble form who had personal charms few could match. Unsurprisingly, the 15-year-old Hester caught the eye of a young enslaved man named Edward Roberts. The two developed an intense romance, much to her owner, Aaron Anthony's displeasure. Anthony had a long history of sexually assaulting enslaved women, and now Hester was the focus of his attention. He made it his mission to, quote, break up the growing intimacy between Hester and Edward, said Douglass. Because he wanted to access Hester whenever and wherever, he ordered her not to go out in the evenings and warned that he must never catch her in Edward's company. One night, Anthony went looking for Hester as he had done on many nights before. After conducting an extensive search, he found her with Edward, the young man he had forbidden her to see. He was infuriated. According to Douglass, Anthony dragged Hester into the very kitchen where she worked and slept, tore off her clothes, tied her hands together, and hung her body from a hook in the ceiling. Next, he flogged her with a cowhide whip. With each strike, Hester yelled out. A 7-year-old Frederick Douglass, who had been asleep in a makeshift closet in the kitchen, was awakened by her, quote, heart-rending shrieks, a sound that became grossly familiar to him with time. Douglass said that he had heard of floggings before, but something transformative occurred when he first bore witness to this sexual assault through the boards of the makeshift closet. Though a child, he learned how grotesque and sexually charged Anthony's displays of ownership and power were. Recounting the whip, blood, and thickness of the air, Douglass likened this first assault to a quote-unquote blood-stained gate, and it was his personal entryway into the hell of slavery. In his telling of the sexualized violence inflicted on his aunt, Douglass gave voice to the trauma he incurred as a witness to this brutality. His trauma did not mirror Hester's, of course, but the impressions became permanently etched in Douglass's consciousness. He said, quote, I was quite a child, but I will remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. He then said, quote, it was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It was Douglass's fate of knowing the dreadful possibilities and knowing the enslaved person's constraints in escaping such fates that stood before him, this metaphorical blood-stained gate. Passage through the gate was not voluntary. The sight of his aunt struck him with awful force, Douglass said, hurling him across the threshold to the other side. It was in my quest to better understand the emotional toll that rape, sexual violence, and reproductive exploitation took on enslaved women that I first encountered Douglass's accounts of his aunt Hester. As I read and reread Douglass's accounts of Hester's abuse, I began to pay more attention to how he described his own relationship to Anthony's assault on Hester. It is intuitive to focus one's attention on Hester. Enslaved women and girls were the primary victims of systematic rape and sexual assault under chattel slavery. What is less visible and has received less scholarly attention is the trauma suffered by those like Douglass, who bore witness through sight or sound, or who learned of these events secondhand. Douglass's words were begging me to pay attention to the collective impact of the systematic rape and sexual exploitation of enslaved women like Hester. The slaveholding South cultivated a rape culture that had implications for more than just enslaved women, but would be consequential for the political, social, and economic lives of both enslavers and the enslaved living within the South's plantation complex. By definition, a rape culture exists when societal beliefs and ideals normalize sexual violence and thus foster environments conducive to rape. You might be familiar with expressions like, oh, well, boys will be boys. These are the sorts of things that I'm talking about. Rape culture is a useful framework for understanding the very establishment of the colonies that would become the United States because of how critical the systematic rape of Black women especially, and the sexual exploitation of Black people more broadly were to the founding of the nation. Rape, sexual coercion, and forced sexual reproduction were not simply ill-fated byproducts or unintended evils of chattel slavery in the antebellum South. Rather, white male slave owners, plantation overseers, slave patrollers, who were our nation's first police force, by the way, and others consciously raped and sexually exploited enslaved women to demonstrate and reinforce their dominance over not only enslaved women, but enslaved communities and Southern society at large. Sexual violence became inseparable from the everydayness of life for those like Hester, her lover Edward, Douglass, and the other enslaved people who lived within earshot of Hester's cries. They shared a collective understanding of what was possible and who was vulnerable within this rape culture that was constructed over years of experience, witnessing, and teaching. The South's rape culture had a physical and metaphorical reach that encompassed white Southerners as well. While they were not the targeted victims of this systematic rape and exploitation, they also shared in the knowledge of slave-owning men's common engagement in interracial sex and sexual violence against enslaved women. By witnessing and through instruction from one generation to the next, they too learned the violent forms that slave-owning power could take, and that this unfettered sexual violence against the enslaved could result in consequences for their own families and communities. Of record, the white occupants of Anthony's household, which included his son Andrew, his daughter Lucretia, along with her husband Thomas Auld, made no meaningful attempts to stop their father's abuse of Hester. They understood that cries from enslaved people were no cause for alarm, but merely the daily sights and sounds of enslavement. They were expected to play their respective roles in his performance of domination. Yet one was not born knowing this script of rape and sexual exploitation. There was a process by which enslaved people and those who owned them came to know their roles. At its core, sexual violence in American slavery is about knowing. I utilized slave narratives and interviews, diaries, letters, and court records to do two things. Number one, to explore how the enslaved and enslavers came to know about the systematic rape and sexual exploitation of enslaved women, and what living within this rape culture meant for their lives and the lives of others. I argue that through sight, sound, lessons taught by parents to children, the enslaved and enslavers learned how to survive and sustain this rape culture. To examine how this and number two, to examine how this shared consciousness between enslavers and the enslaved manifested in their day-to-day navigation of space, interpersonal relationships, and negotiations for power and autonomy. For example, members of these communities learned ways to challenge the boundaries of power that the rape and sexual exploitation of enslaved women were intended to hold firm, subverting their roles to resist, protest others from, and to resist, protect others from, and protest interracial sex and sexual violence. Learning, knowing, and navigating these roles were crucial elements in the making as well as the survival of the South's rape culture. And this is a picture of Eric Anthony's house. He was actually an overseer, meaning that he was basically a plantation manager for someone else who owned a very large plantation and a lot of enslaved people. But he himself was also a slave owner and had his own plantation, but there were levels to this. And so he worked for a man who had hundreds of enslaved people. And he had a house on that property, and there was a detached kitchen, and this is where the enslaved, like Douglas and Hester, that was where they worked and where they lived. I want to spend the rest of my time speaking about enslaved women specifically, and how they came to know and understand their vulnerability to rape and sexual exploitation, and how this knowledge informed their day-to-day lives. When given the chance, how did they negotiate for power and autonomy in this viciously violent system of racialized slavery? I'll start with knowing. Mary Walker was enslaved by Duncan Cameron in Raleigh, North Carolina. In 1848, she accompanied him to Philadelphia to provide care for his sick daughter, Mildred. While there, Walker ran away in hopes of becoming free. Walker's quest for freedom was not without sacrifice. She left behind her mother and her 3 children, Frank, Agnes, and Bryant, who remained enslaved by the Cameron family in Raleigh. So for those of you who are Duke fans, Cameron Indoor Stadium, this is the family that's named for. When Walker escaped, she found refuge for Peter and Susan Leslie, a Philadelphia couple with anti-slavery convictions. For more than a decade, the Leslies strategized alongside Walker and other allies to reunite her with her children. Taking a tremendous risk, Peter Leslie finally wrote a letter directly to Mildred Cameron in 1859. Mildred took possession of Walker's children when her father Duncan died in 1853. Leslie wrote, "I have been lately touched to the heart with a case of heartbreaking distress, which you have it entirely in your power, I find, to cure." He wrote that Walker feared night and day that some terrible calamity would befall her children. However, she was especially fearful for her daughter, whose, quote, "blooming womanhood exposes her more terribly than the worst adventures happening to a young man," wrote Leslie. According to Leslie, Walker consciously expressed that the enslaved woman's entrance into adulthood presented unique challenges and dangers that far surpassed those of young men. By blooming womanhood, she was referring to the phase in most girls' lives when their bodies begin to transform into that of a woman. The widening of one's hips, the budding of breasts, and the onset of menstruation were all indicators of sexual maturation. In the context of chattel slavery, blooming womanhood evoked feelings of terror. She understood that her daughter would become more vulnerable to being raped or sexually coerced and would almost certainly be forced to sexually reproduce. What Walker called blooming womanhood, Harriet Jacobs called, quote, "the sad epic in the life of a slave girl." Jacobs' sad epic began when she was 15 years old, and her owner, James Norcom, began to, quote, "whisper foul words in her ear." Enslaved testimony reveals various coming-of-age stories like that of Jacobs and fears for young girls' safety like that expressed by Mary Walker. Enslaved women like Walker and Jacobs were not born knowing the ways in which rape and sexual exploitation marred their physical and cultural landscapes, nor were they born knowing how to traverse these landscapes. Rather, culture is transmitted across time through social learning, sharing information, issuing warnings, and maintaining a hypervigilance regarding the various modes of sexual violence and exploitation that an enslaved woman or girl might face was key. Also, knowing the physical spaces where enslaved women would be most vulnerable to attack and coercion, and the strategies employed by predators were in fact a part of enslaved communities' efforts to establish some semblance of safety. According to Jacobs, enslaved girls became, quote, "prematurely knowing of sexual violation through sight and sound." She said a young enslaved girl might see her mistress direct, quote, "violent outbreaks of jealous passion." At an enslaved woman, she felt garnered too much of her husband's attention. Even before the slave girl is 12 years old, she, quote, "cannot help but understand the cause," said Jacobs. A time will come when the enslaved girl, quote, "will learn to tremble when she hears her master's footfall." Jacobs learned from the other enslaved people on James Norcom's plantation that he had already fathered 11 children by enslaved women. She said that while they could not allude to such things beyond whispers amongst themselves, fearing dire consequences, they made the most of these opportunities and conveyed solidarity, fear, and pity without using words. Across the antebellum South, enslaved women like Mary Walker and Harriet Jacobs relied on their individual strength and the fortitude of their communities, applying knowledge born of experience and wisdom to evade and survive the terror of rape and sexual exploitation. This is an image of James Moultrie Jr. and the woman who I'm going to talk to you about, Julia Alexander. I don't have an image for her because, like most enslaved people, she did not have her photo taken and didn't survive to the archive. So now I will talk about negotiating. Beyond survival, some enslaved women used their knowledge to negotiate for power and autonomy. Although many enslaved women fought hard to resist rape and sexual exploitation, even resorting to violence, some appealed to white men's sexual interests, or sought to turn sexually violent and coercive encounters into opportunities to improve the conditions of their lives and those of their children. Julia Alexander of Chester, South Carolina was one such woman. In November 1859, Julia Alexander sparked a firestorm of emotion, fear, shame, frustration, among a group of white men who moved within South Carolina's most elite social and professional circles. Dr. James Moultrie Jr., a well-respected physician in Charleston, who contributed to the founding of the state's first medical college, was the central figure around which this group of men in the controversy formed. Alexander had identified Moultrie as the father of her child and demanded that he not only provide financial support, but also publicly acknowledge their daughter by giving her his last name. At first, Moultrie most likely rejected Alexander's demands. Enslavers assumed absolute power over the enslaved, which was coded into the law. And her requests threatened this power dynamic. In rare instances, white men openly acknowledged their enslaved children, legally emancipated them, and bequeathed land and money for their education and long-term care. Most white men, however, looked on their enslaved progeny like any other children born to enslaved women, as extensions of their wealth rather than themselves. Alexander, however, intended for Moultrie to make her daughter the exception, whether through choice or coercion. Southern men like Moultrie tremendously valued honor, one of the pillars through which they asserted authority within the public and private spheres. Moultrie was the great-nephew of Major General William Moultrie, for whom Fort Moultrie was named. He was not just a prominent physician, but an institution builder. In addition to co-founding the Medical College of South Carolina, which is now in USC up the road, Moultrie helped to create the American Medical Association, the South Carolina Medical Association, and the South Carolina Historical Society, whose archive is housed here at the College of Charleston. Ideally, an honorable Southern gentleman refrained from engaging in interracial sex. However, Southern men frequently had sex with enslaved women by force and other coercive means, and fathered enslaved children with impunity. If these men were discreet and avoided shaming their families, white Southerners generally carried on with their day-to-day activities, blocking out the visual and auditory evidence of the sexualized violence and reproductive exploitation perpetrated on enslaved females and males. Fearful of the damage that Alexander's claims could do to Moultrie's reputation, he and his associates moved quickly to protect his honorable status. They believed strongly that his reputation should not be scathed by something as ubiquitous as sexual relations with an enslaved woman. James Pettigrew, a highly sought attorney in Charleston and one of Moultrie's key allies, promised Moultrie's cooperation in aiding Alexander's child in exchange for everyone's discretion, and a promise from Alexander that she would stop demanding a formal acknowledgement of paternity. From all accounts, Julia Alexander was a formidable woman. Although the law forbade it, she knew how to read and write, skills that she did not hide. She openly corresponded with white people such as James Moultrie to express her needs. Many of the details of Alexander's life are lost to the archive, including the circumstances that led to her pregnancy. We can only speculate on where and when Alexander and Moultrie first met and engaged in sexual relations, and whether they had one sexual encounter or a long-term sexual liaison. There were so many opportunities for a white man of wealth and status to find a sexual partner or target, particularly an enslaved woman. With great probability, Moultrie coerced Alexander, perhaps even resorting to threats or violence. When Julia Alexander confronted Moultrie with his paternity of her daughter, she did not do so alone. She drew on support from a small group of people who, though unidentified, were likely white people of enough status to position them to confront Moultrie. According to Pettigrew, Alexander had appealed to her quote-unquote friends, as he called them, to be witnesses to, quote, the way with which the child first saw the light. Her friends demanded that Moultrie take responsibility for fathering Alexander's child, clearly giving credence to her accusation. Despite his deep entrenchment in Charleston society, Moultrie believed that Alexander's friends' testimonies could generate the kind of scandal he wanted to avoid. How Alexander formed an alliance with this group and why they took such an interest in ensuring that Moultrie supported her child remains unclear and is by far extremely exceptional. However, the alliance illustrates Alexander's ability to navigate spaces and people, Black, white, enslaved, and free. She maneuvered unpaved highways from Chester to the streets of Charleston, holding private meetings where she revealed secrets and rallied support. Alexander's strategizing, along with the pressure from her allies, captured Moultrie's attention. He saw no choice but to seek allies of his own if he wished to walk away, reputation intact. By the time Moultrie confided his troubles in James Pettigrew, his friend and trusted legal counsel, he had already paid Alexander 2 lump sums of money, with at least one in the amount of $300, and had pledged a third. He hoped the payments would silence Alexander and her friends, but in his first letter to James Pettigrew, he enclosed the latest letter that Alexander had written to him to show that he had failed to neutralize her threats. Moultrie's letter to Pettigrew also included a third undisclosed sum of money that Pettigrew needed to pass along to Alexander to induce her silence. After receiving Moultrie's letter, Pettigrew sat down to write the first of several letters he drafted on Moultrie's behalf. He sent the first, dated November 17, 1859, to Robert A. Pagan, sheriff of Chester District, now Chester County. Before Pettigrew's involvement, Moultrie had trusted Pagan to place the first 2 payments in Alexander's hand, so he was very familiar with the circumstances. In his letter, Pettigrew thanked Pagan for his friendly aid he had provided Moultrie, and bemoaned that Moultrie was, quote, suffering far beyond the common lot for a common fault. The letter's main theme, however, was Pettigrew's astonishment over Julia Alexander's audacity. He found it preposterous that an enslaved woman could generate so much trouble for Moultrie himself and their associates. He wrote, frankly, that Alexander's scheme, quote, would not be tolerated even in the case of a white woman. With a successful law practice in the heart of downtown Charleston, Pettigrew knew the state statutes and city ordinances that regulated behavior of enslaved and free Black people. Pettigrew anticipated that Alexander, if reported, would, quote, deserve the severity of the code. He asked Pagan to tell Alexander that her threats would no longer provoke him or Moultrie and they, quote, would surely hand her over to the police. Undoubtedly, Julia Alexander knew how daring and dangerous her actions were. She broke the law every time she put pen to paper. To write out her demands of a white enslaver marked an even bolder move. Per the South Carolina Negro Act, she could have been charged with, quote unquote, insolence to a white person, a crime punishable with violence, quote, not extended to life or limb. Beyond penalty of law, Moultrie could have encouraged Alexander's owner to sell her or her child to an out-of-state buyer, silencing her forever. Indeed, Alexander appeared fearless. Alexander determined to shield her daughter from the weight of subjection. This desire to protect children and grieve over their futures in bondage pervaded the writings of enslaved and self-emancipated women. Julia Alexander aspired to more than security, however. What she demanded of Moultrie tested the elasticity of Southern honor. She wanted her daughter to benefit from her familial connection to an honorable Southern gentleman, to secure freedom, financial stability, a name. Alexander appeared willing to exhaust Moultrie's social capital, even ruining his reputation in exchange for her child's freedom and economic support. Freedom and financial stability would have instantaneously shifted her daughter's positionality, in South Carolina society. Although Alexander's child can never experience the privileges of whiteness in the antebellum South, she would gain certain legal rights and be able to maneuver spaces and institutions inaccessible to enslaved people. Alexander was under no illusion that Moultrie and her daughter would have a traditional father-daughter relationship, where her child would walk the streets of Charleston with her arm curled around his, receive invitations to coveted social events, or be accepted into the Moultrie family. However, Moultrie could ensure that her daughter, as his daughter, escaped a life in bondage. In his letter to Robert Pagan, James Pettigrew conveyed that Moultrie was willing to entertain any quote-unquote reasonable proposal to stop Julia Alexander, but remained steadfast in his denying the child his last name. Pettigrew wrote, his convictions as to the poor thing's paternity is immovable, and he never will countenance the impertinence of giving her his name or of assuming that which he has strenuously denied. This placed Alexander and Moultrie at a crossroads. Even though Julia Alexander had not convinced Moultrie to change his stance, she spurred him and his allies to continue generating solutions that would satisfy her. Their ideas varied, ranging from punitive to compassionate, and their sympathies, while always with Moultrie, occasionally fell on the enslaved child whose existence brought them together. For starters, Pettigrew declined to report Alexander to legal authorities, even though he was itching to. He said it in every letter. He decided instead to write a memorandum with a list of questions he intended to ask her. Rather than the frustration and scorn that his early correspondence revealed, his questions hinted of his consideration, if not deference, for Alexander's desires for her child's future. For example, he asked, quote, is she to be brought up a white child or a colored? And is she to be brought up in the country or in town? Pettigrew's questions were unfathomable to most enslaved parents who, because their children did not legally belong to them, rarely were given the authority to contribute to such decisions. By offering Alexander the choice to determine her daughter's race, Pettigrew positioned her to not only designate the girl as a free person, but a free white person, That is, if her physical features allowed her to easily pass into white society. Per South Carolina law, a person's skin color could be, quote, prima facie evidence for enslavement and be, quote, the party bearing the color of a Negro, mulatto, or mestizo is a slave until proven otherwise. Alexander had ample reasons to believe her daughter would have greater opportunities if raised as a white child. While free Black people could marry other free people, purchase and sell property, and work for wages, they were not citizens, but denizens of the state with limited freedoms. They experienced segregation in public spaces such as churches, hotels, and restaurants. In Charleston, free Black residents had to pay a yearly capitation or head tax simply for being Black. It is an understatement to say that Pettigrew offered Alexander extraordinary choices on Moultrie's behalf. In a letter from Dr. William Wiley, one of Moultrie's associates, to James Pettigrew, we learn that Julia Alexander took time to contemplate Pettigrew's questions. Wiley reported that she gave him Pettigrew's memo along with her written response. While Pettigrew's memo survived, Alexander's statement did not. What happened next, however, was a direct result of the words she placed on that piece of paper. First, Moultrie decided to establish a trust to pay for his daughter's, quote, support and education in a way suitable to her condition till she is of age or married. Next, he selected Alexander Quay Donovan, a wealthy planter in Chester and former member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, as the child's guardian to carry out his plans for her education and well-being. Then Pettigrew continued the work of determining how much money Moultrie should invest in the child's trust. In his memo to Alexander, he initially suggested $50 per year. To the enslaved mother, this was not nearly enough. According to Pettigrew, $1,000 was the amount, quote, which the girl now says she will be content with if a trustee can be found. On January 24th, 1860, James Pettigrew wrote to Alexander Wiley what appears to be his last letter regarding Moultrie's paternity scandal. He confirmed that while they all held Moultrie in high esteem, Moultrie sensed that his goodwill would soon expire. According to Pettigrew, Moultrie felt, quote, no doubt it will be generally considered as great weakness to yield so much to the species of extortion that has been practiced on him. Pettigrew just as easily could have penned those words for himself, Wiley or Pagan. Alexander had met with each of them when they served as Moultrie's couriers, delivering messages and money. Even if they did so with contempt, they helped Alexander to extort money and negotiate for the education and potential freedom of her daughter. And worse, Pettigrew sensed the fight was far from over. He concluded that even if Alexander and Moultrie's daughter were emancipated, quote, the same sort of appeals would be sure to be made if the child should be in want. As an enslaved woman, perhaps the most powerful thing Julia Alexander did was place these men on their heels, forcing them to grapple with their ideals of manhood and shaking their confidence in their authority as Southern white gentlemen. Although Alexander's enslaved daughter, because of her race, gender, and enslaved status, would never be untethered from the gendered prescriptions of white supremacy and Southern patriarchy that subjugated her, Alexander understood the power of connecting her daughter to Moultrie's whiteness and social standing. She insisted Moultrie acknowledge her child and give her his last name because she knew the power that a respectable name carried. As an enslaved Black woman, Alexander seemed at first an improbable opponent for the esteemed Charleston physician. But she was able to use her knowledge of Southern honor and its correlation to white Southern manhood, freedom, economic security, and status to leverage influence over Moultrie and his associates. As a parting note, James Pettigrew said to Alexander Wiley, quote, "I wish that you would see the girl's letters burnt, for I am ashamed to think that he has borne so much calumny. It is unknown whether Wiley destroyed all of Julia Alexander's letters, but their absence from any archive renders a deafening silence, which is what Moultrie and Pettigrew wanted. What happened to Julia Alexander and her daughter after January 1860 also remains unknown. Throughout the correspondence, no one referred to the child's name, making it virtually impossible to track her down in surviving records. As the Civil War waged the next year, Alexander and Moultrie's daughter grew, and as she remained enslaved, she found freedom once United States troops carried emancipation into the crumbling Confederacy. With war's end and Reconstruction, she may have joined the thousands of Black Southerners who fled northward and westward. If she may have chosen to remain in South Carolina, or she may have chosen to remain in South Carolina. There were many possibilities for her life, further contributing to the historian's difficult task of figuring out what became of her. More verifiable is that James Moultrie's fears of losing his honorable reputation went unrealized. He went to his grave with the admiration of his peers. After his death in 1869, the Medical Society of South Carolina published a 22-page memoir lauding Moultrie's life and contributions to the medical profession in South Carolina and beyond. While it was not captured in the written story of his life, he likely never forgot what it was like to battle the strong will of one audacious and determined enslaved mother. I'd like to end by offering you this. You may ask, why does this history matter? There are many, including state legislators, school board members, and federal officials who today characterize slavery as an irrelevant and ancient past, as though it did not have many afterlives. I argue that it continues to have afterlives. When the Civil War ended, Black men and women across the South embarked on constructing a new free world. They built churches and schools, established businesses, and engaged in leisure, partying in dance halls, drinking in saloons, and hanging out on street corners. Angered by the sight of Black people exercising and enjoying their rights of citizenship, Southern whites inflicted violence and destruction on Black communities to assert white dominance. They burned churches, schools, and businesses, and threatened Black men who dared to vote. White men also turned to rape and sexual violence to affirm their racial and sexual power in this newly emancipated landscape. They raped and harassed Black women for participating in Republican Party politics and challenging white authority as free women. Black people maintained their consciousness, however, of Black women's vulnerability to rape and sexual exploitation. They witnessed and experienced how white men continued to use sex to assert racial and sexual power over Black people in the decades that followed. They also saw Black men lynched, often purported to have raped or engaged in consensual sex with white women. Many of these men were only guilty of pursuing economic independence and political engagement. Their consciousness continued to evolve to accommodate the evolving rape culture of post-slavery America. Well into the mid-20th century, these tools of racial oppression, burning businesses, bombing churches, rape, and lynching, remained virtually the same. Slavery and its afterlives are not an ancient and irrelevant history. As students of history, by moving the rape and sexual exploitation of enslaved women from the periphery to the center of enslavers and enslaved people's experiences, we learn how significant white men's sexual power and Black women's sexual exploitation were to the founding of the nation, and how significant they continue to be long after slavery's end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eaves, for sharing this with us. Thank you. And again, we want to thank you all for being here. If folks who don't have seats want to take some, there are some in the front, if you are tired of standing. Yes. So it's time for the Q&A. We're going to go ahead and let you moderate as you will, and we're going to pass the mic around. So folks who wish to ask a question, if you want to raise your hand, then we will get the mic to you.
Probably, well, I guess we want everybody to hear it. Yep. Hi, Shannon. So that was incredible. Thank you. I have a question that you may have already sort of preceded a little bit, which is that you start by talking about how children learn and children's parents learn about the peril that young enslaved girls face and how they're sort of constantly under sexual threat from a young age. And then you ended with this story of a mother trying to protect her daughter. And so I was curious, in this archive of this conversation around Julia Alexander and her daughter, whether you noticed, basically my question is, do you think that both Julia and these men were talking about this daughter and her hypothetical future in qualitatively different terms than they would talk about a son because of this particular peril that young enslaved women were under?
I would say that, it's from, my reading of the archive, enslaved parents have given the opportunity, advocated for their sons and their daughters. But they very much had this understanding that there was something extra that their daughters were especially vulnerable to. And so I can imagine that, if, Julia Alexander had a son, she would, perhaps be going about the same sorts of actions, but I would find it very hard to believe, especially the fact that she has this child by a white man, right? And so in the archive, when we especially look at enslaved people's testimonies, many of them point to themselves, their own conception, as evidence of this rape culture, that they are the product of this sexual violence. And so that, of course, aids in their hypervigilance towards their children and the next generation. And, I can't really, from the letters that I read between Pettigrew and the people that he wrote, they are talking about Alexander and this child as a nuisance. One thing I will say though is, I can't say that that Moultrie has any sort of concern for his daughter, because, she is a girl as opposed to a boy. But one of his friends does offer in the letter that, because there's this whole question of why is he conceding to these things? Because before he even involves Pettigrew, he's already paid, he's already given her 2 sums of money, and it is now willing to pass on a third, right? And so they're kind of asking, like, why is he doing all of this? And so one of his friends offers that it's perhaps because he and his wife of 40 plus years never had any children. And that having children and passing on a legacy was also very much like well entrenched in people's identity and like their understanding of like what it meant to be a respectable Southern gentleman and lady. And so that this was perhaps providing him with this last ditch effort, you know, again, he's been married over 40 years, but I can also see why he's so committed to wanting to keep this silent, because up to this point, he and his wife don't have any children, right? And perhaps the narrative is that he and his wife can't have children. But if now this enslaved child pops up, you know, this begins to create a threat for his wife as well, as, you know, as could potentially cause her to now grapple with the fact that they don't have children because of some failing on her part, which was, you know, something that women during this time period, you know, very much, you know, wanted to avoid and, you know, would speak so painfully about, you know, if they could not fulfill that destiny of, you know, being a mother and creating a respectable household. So, you know, I found that to be really interesting when I read that. It was actually Dr. Wiley who threw that out there.
Good afternoon. Do you believe the severity of sexual violence is starting out of adultification of Black children?
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Do you believe the severity of sexual violence during the chattel slavery contributes now to the adultification of Black children?
You know, I would say that yes, it does. And, you know, when you say the adultification of Black children, you know, there's been lots of studies that have been done that show that people tend to, if they are given images of a 12-year-old Black girl versus a 12-year-old white girl, they often perceive the Black body as more mature, more advanced, you know, not advanced in terms of like, you know, intellectual advancement, but in terms of sexual maturity. And I think that it absolutely has roots in just the overall hyper-sexualization of Black bodies that we see happening at the very moment that Europeans are observing Africans in West Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries. They, you know, they're traveling there and they write extensively about their bodies. And some of this is because, you know, these are different worlds where, you know, ideas about modesty and clothing are very different. So because they are able to physically observe these people's bodies, you know, they talk about Black women's breasts and they make these arguments about how their breasts are so long and monstrous that they can, you know, throw their breasts over their shoulder and feed their babies while they're bending over and you know, have their babies tied on their back and they're able to bend over in the fields, right? And how they're able to, you know, sexually reproduce and then like, you know, give birth to a baby one day and be out working in the fields with men the next day, right? This notion that in terms of sexual reproduction that Black people are almost animalistic in that way. And so when we think about in the context of chattel slavery, this bodes well when your enslaved labor force needs to reproduce itself, right? And so if you already have these preconceived notions about Black people's, you know, hypersexuality and you know, and you equate their bodies to those of animals, you know, it's easy to then apply, you know, the science of like animal husbandry to people and assume that they are capable of doing that enslaved women should be capable of giving birth to a child every single year, which was the expectation. And also continued to labor in the fields all the way up through those pregnancies and very soon after birth. And so we see the continued, when we think about our cultural rhetoric around sexuality, they're continued even after slavery to be this sense that Black people were hypersexual. It's when I talked about lynching. No one was during slavery in a city like Charleston, 90% Black population. No one was concerned that Black men were these inherently, rapacious beasts, right? It's when Black men gain the right to vote. It's when they're winning elections. It's when they are building businesses that society draws on this, creates this phrase and this myth of the Black male rapist. And therefore, there has to be this hypervigilance around protecting white womanhood. And this is what leads to this period of ritualized violence and lynching Black men, accusing them of raping white women or looking at white women wrong or, just lingering in the wrong spaces in close proximity to white women because they are now all of a sudden, these predators to society. And so, this is what I talked about, how slavery has its afterlives. And there's studies that show that Black girls are more likely to be suspended for dress code violations than white girls in school. And it's because of the way that their bodies are perceived. Not that they're wearing different styles and trends per se, but because of this adultification, as you said, and this tendency to want to sexualize them and honestly to rob them of the innocence of girlhood. That's what, when we think about this rape culture, that's what it was, robbing enslaved girls of the innocence of childhood.
Hey, my name is Taekwon. I'm really interested, one, the subject, so thank you so much. I'm excited to read the book a little bit more in depth, but also just interested to know, through your research, did you ever find, any information about how these women healed, right? What are some of the coping mechanisms? I'm sure spirituality was a big piece of it. I'm sure community was also a big piece of it, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you have it.
My biggest takeaway was just creating, to the best that they could, enslaved communities, trying to create this a sense of safety to the best way that they could. And I think that the way that they coped with this was through education, was through telling these cautionary tales, making sure that the next generation was hypervigilant. I think that through education, through preparation, and through continuing to just be concerned and trying to offer those modes of protection, I think that's perhaps how one generation copes with their trauma, is to try to protect the next as best that they could. I also think that just through collective grieving, there's this one source that I have that talks about how actually this slave trader was transporting a group of enslaved people to Georgia, and along the way they stop, and there's, and usually when we think about what becomes this massive deportation of enslaved people into the Deep South, any day you would see these what they call coffles of enslaved people being marched from the East Coast into the Deep South. And often the enslaved people would be forced to walk, but slave traders or the people who owned them would ride in these wagons. And on this stop, the slave trader, sexually assaults this enslaved woman in the wagon. And then afterwards, he goes and he sells her. He sells her to someone else. And so the enslaved man who witnessed this and who wrote about this, one of the things that he talked about specifically was the way in which the women who were left behind, who were multi-generational, just gathered together and just wept and held each other. And so I think that just, having kinship and in being able to, having that common understanding of like what just happened, I think that clinging to one another and looking to one another for solace and, again, a sense of safety. I mean, I can imagine that they were holding tight to one another also out of fear of perhaps being grabbed next.
I wanted to ask how your research is being received. And secondly, I find myself lingering in the idea of Julia Alexander and the strategy, the resilience, the advocacy, and I can't help but connect that to here and now. So any thoughts you have on that and what we can take away from her story and her extraordinary courage and resilience?
The work has been received, really well so far. I mean, with my peers, I've gotten nothing but just support and, just expressions of how important the work is, which, obviously makes me feel not necessarily proud, but makes me feel like all of the time and all of the sort of, the sacrifice that I made being steeped in this, to be steeped in this history and in these archives for so long, makes it really feel worth it. I think the best thing that I experience though is when students, come up to me and provide their feedback. I've had a couple of colleagues in my department now who assigned the book, and I've been at events and I've had students come up to me and talk about how much they really appreciated the work, how much it opened up their eyes to history that they didn't know before, and so that's perhaps the most rewarding response that I can get. It's interesting because we had a student seminar earlier today where students who wanted to talk more closely about the book came and gathered, and one of the things that came up was, what do we do in the face of what feels like insurmountable, challenges, or how do we handle it when people misconstrue historical facts or information to perpetuate their current political, economic agendas. And so one of the things that I said in that space was that people will always be loud and wrong. And so it is imperative that we be loud and right. And, I think in terms of Julia Alexander, I mean, there's so many ways in which I cannot even fathom the things that she did, because I just know how dangerous the things that she did were. People were killed for less, for much less. And, if anything, I think it gives me courage that if she could be so audacious in the face of death, then we certainly can in the face of, political ostracizing or the fear of losing your job. We're in a moment where I really wish that, we had elected officials who were willing to lose elections because they were standing on the grounds of right, who were, willing to lose an election because they were defending the Constitution and the rule of law. And so, I think, that's my biggest takeaway, to just, be loud and right, regardless of the consequences.
Hello. You talked about Meredith Douglas witnessing his Aunt Hester's abuse and assault. And you also mentioned his future participation. Could you expand on this and also discuss how it still affects us to this day?
Yeah, when he said that he not only felt like a witness but a participant, that really touched me in reading that, because, I think what he's saying is that in him, he talks about being like struck and he couldn't, paralyzed really, and he couldn't move and he didn't help her. And so in so many ways, that made him, I guess, feel a sense of shame, but also understanding why. He understood why he was paralyzed in that moment, because he knew what would happen if he had opened that door. And that's the power of violence. That's what violence does. It's why one person with a gun can, bring to submission a room full of people. Violence it's why witnessing a violent act will keep people in submission for fear that such act could befall them. And so, again, that sort of, his understanding of that led me to realize that, this was a very traumatic experience for him too. And so, do you mind elaborating on the second part of your question about him speaking about the participation, and you said something about today?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the sexual violence that we see today can kind of permeate different circles and can affect individuals that may not be directly related to it. And so how it was built up in the past affect us to this day, I guess, is what I meant.
Yeah, well, I mean, you currently inhabit one of the most sexually fraught spaces in our country, a college campus. There's, this concept, this framework, this concept of a rape culture, it continues to exist. 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted on college campuses. And it's because we over time have created, and we continue to reinforce these notions of, things like I said earlier, that boys will be boys, or, why was she at the party alone? Why did she walk home by herself? What was she wearing? How short was the skirt, right? Those are those types of cultural understandings and norms that normalize sexual assault and pivot the responsibility to not be assaulted on the victim, and empower the assaulter to be able to continue to assault. So, we're not rid of that culture. I mean, I said I wasn't gonna say this, but I'm gonna go ahead and just say it. The fact that, you know, we have a president who has been held liable for sexual assault and people were willing to disregard that and elect him lets you know just how powerful or just how perversive rape culture is. We live in a society that normalizes sexual assault. It causes people not to bat an eye. It apparently doesn't speak to one's character to sexually assault someone or to brag about, you know, how they can sexually assault women and get away with it. This is all evidence of a rape culture. And, you know, it's not just a phenomenon that existed in the past. You know, rape cultures continue to exist today, like I said, on college campuses, you know, within our armed forces. These are spaces where, you know, men and women are sexually assaulted and are silenced for fear of losing their jobs, for fear of, you know, speaking out against an institution. It's still very pervasive.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. So it's a hard question, so I've written this down.
Take your time.
Much of the focus of many discussions of slavery, Reconstruction, to modern day are focused on the horrors and the traumas and the pain. And while white Southerners have had the consciousness and have known, I feel like that word was really powerful, have known, it's very easy to turn away from history, and when given the opportunity, a lot of white people, white Southerners, would much rather turn away because it is easier. Where in these incredibly important discussions of incredibly painful history do we begin to talk about responsibility and the responsibility of white people today for the pain and the trauma caused by their ancestors.
Ooh, that's a very powerful and heavy question. I think that number one, I think all of us have a responsibility to understand our past and to not just understand it or reimagine it or whitewash it, but to really understand it and just sit in it. And so I think, you know, as a historian, one of the things that just really ruffles my feathers is when, you know, people talk about how we should not, in the teaching of history, we shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable. And I would argue that learning and teaching and engaging in history is not an exercise in comfortability. It's, you know, as a teacher, it's not my job to make people comfortable. I would want anyone in a room, no matter who your ancestors were, to be uncomfortable by this history. If this history does not make you uncomfortable, you need to do some really deep, you know, introspection, right? there's nothing comfortable about violence and trauma, right? But so I think that there kind of in lies the rub, that it's that the pursuit of a more perfect union is about understanding the past and not repeating it. And in order to do that, though, like you said, you can't turn away from it, right? And it's not about taking on the burden, right, of what your ancestors did. It's about what decision is your generation going to make? What are future generations going to say about you? What are your choices and what are your actions in light of the fact that you have this knowledge of the horrors of the past? Are you willing to grapple with the ways in which some of those horrors have ended, but have perhaps taken on, a little bit of a lighter form, but still very much exist? What are the sort of systemic inequalities and what sort of systemic oppressions still exist in this particular moment? And I think that's how anyone should judge themselves, right? What did you do in the face of these things? Did you pretend like they didn't happen because perhaps you benefit in some ways from the subjugation of other people? And sometimes people benefit from the subjugation of other people consciously and unconsciously. There's things that we might not even be thinking about. There's technology, right, that we engage with every day that is here as a result of the forced labor of a child somewhere else. There's enough sort of responsibility to go around, to everybody. So, I think that, for me, in an ideal world, we as Americans would grapple with our past, think about the ways in which we are still influenced by our past, and to not deny our past or even our present for the sake of power, political expediency, and certainly to not gaslight other people into thinking that their lived experiences are not real. That would be my hope.
Hello everyone, my name is Jason Coy and I'm the interim dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the College of Charleston. I want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Professor Shannon Eaves, for this wonderful, very powerful, very moving presentation. And I want to invite all of you to a reception out in the atrium. Thank you very much.